George Mahfouz is going to give us his reminiscences about the Dayton project and the early days of Mound. George was the first presenter in this series, and we started it 4 years ago. And he's going to essentially tell the same story, but we have a lot more photographs and so forth to go along with it this time. So this is sort of the record copy of, we hope, of George's presentation. I think most of you know George, and he's been with us for a long time, but he had a bachelor's degree from the University of Iowa in chemistry. Then he worked at the U.S. Rubber Company in Naugatuck, Connecticut, Williamsport, Pennsylvania, both. Yeah. And he told me the other day he just became an engineer through reading his roommate's textbook. He was on the night shift and he needed something to do in the daytime. He read his engineering textbooks and asking questions about all the problems and so forth. So that was his engineering education, which he pursued thereafter. And he went to the Udai Hershey Company in Decatur, Illinois, and there they were involved in the development of gaseous diffusion barriers, which were later used in K-25 in Oak Ridge. He came to the Manhattan Project as the Dayton Project in Mound, and he survived that and stayed on the move to Mound, and even got the job of cleaning up the Bone Break Academy. Unit 3 and Unit 4 is his job. He's a good cleanup man, and he was involved in the building of planning and building of the T building, which was the heart of Mound originally, certainly. And he stayed on till the bitter end almost, and he's knows where a lot of the skeletons are, so he's going to talk a little about this tonight. George.
First, I want to thank you for being here on such a miserable night. As I told Don when I came in, if I wasn't a speaker, I wouldn't have been here. But anyway, the topic, of course, is the Dayton Project. And let's get the next slide. First thing, of course, will be the research and development that went on prior to Monsanto even getting involved in the Manhattan Project. Right, this is a list of R&D work. Hopefully all you graduated from the 7th grade, so I know you can read. In our case, the important name in my book, as you come down, besides Einstein, he was pretty much frozen out of the loop for the Manhattan Project. He wrote the letter to Roosevelt. That was about the end of it. He had leftist leanings, and General Groves, that is, kind of froze him out. Groves actually adopted Chadwick as his #1 civilian assistant, if you will, beside Oppenheimer. And Chadwick's accomplishments are, I don't know when the guys, as a matter of fact, most of these guys, if you read their biographies, you don't know when they even had time to eat or even time to sleep. It's just, I feel like a failure if you want to know the truth. Okay, next slide, please. In our case, the top row, second picture from the left, Madame Curie is the inventor or developer or the discoverer of polonium, and she and her husband discovered it back in 1898. They were also responsible for discovering radium. Unfortunately, they didn't have the health physics people there, and she developed cancer, and her daughter developed cancer, and I believe her husband also developed cancer, and that did him in. The gentleman on the right, Becquerel, his claim to fame in my book, as I said, all these individuals have a biography that's unbelievable. But Becquerel is the individual who guaranteed that Marie Curie's write-up on her discovery in the chemistry and what have you of polonium and radium was published. Back in 1898, I don't want to offend the ladies, but when you did something scientific that needed to be published, you couldn't do it on your own. I would just forget it. It wouldn't happen. The other individual I mentioned earlier, Chadwick, down here in the lower left, was a Nobel Prize winner. Most of these people were Nobel Prize winners, by the way. But Chadwick was the person that had Groves' attention. Groves had a tremendous amount of respect for him. Chadwick wound up at Los Alamos in time, and the write-up said that, of course, his family joined him, and the house that they lived in was a log cabin, and it was only one of 5 that had a bathtub. I don't know what that does for you, but that's it. Szilard, the next picture on the right, is the individual who convinced Einstein to jog Roosevelt into approving money for the Manhattan Project. He was only one of the people that had influence in that case. And then from there, Fermi, of course, most of you remember, is the guy that almost blew up the University of Chicago field house. Not really. He knew what he was doing. Thank God he did. But anyway, with that, let's go to the next slide now. Strassman was one of the chemists that worked with Fermi, and Lisa Meitner was, I think, Otto Hahn's cousin or relative or aunt or something like that. She was also a radiochemist. They didn't have such an animal as a radiochemist. That's my definition today. And Walter Zinn worked with Szilard at Columbia University, and after the war, he became director of Argonne Lab and was involved in the design and construction of probably something in the order of 5 to 7 nuclear reactors throughout the United States. Next slide, please. Okay, Star of Manhattan Project. I'm going to let you, there we are. Okay, now to begin with, Charlie Thomas, who I'm sure all you ex-Monsanto employees recognize as having been one of 2 partners of Dayton Central Laboratories over on, come on up to the room up here in the front. I don't want to embarrass you. I already have, right? I've been a member of the NDRC, which is national, I think I can remember this, the National Defense Research Council, and he was in charge of Division 8, so I knew there were at least 8 divisions to that. No, that's all right. He had been invited to go to an underground test someplace in the east, never have been able to find out where. But Charlie went east, witnessed this underground test, and while he was there, he became acquainted with Charles Conan Bryant, who was president of Harvard University, and pretty much the #1 guy in the NRDC. I think I got that right. And they formed a very fast friendship because they had a lot of they clicked, to put it quite simply. Well, after about a couple of months or so, Charlie, I can call him Charlie now, but in the old days I called him Dr. Thomas. I don't sure know that. But anyway, he got a call from Washington, from General Groves, and of course with the war going on and the general calling you up and said, I'd like to have you come to my office next week, the answer obviously was yes. So he went to see Charlie Thomas, and when he got there was Dr. Bryant in his office, and then they told him about the Manhattan Project. Of course, obviously, in the meantime, in that 2 months or so, he'd been investigated by either the FBI or whoever they hired to do that kind of work. So they sat down and they had a discussion about that, and he spent most of the day after that talking with Dr. Conan Bryant about the Manhattan Project, and then they went out. Obviously, he was going to support the effort. Again, he was not going to say, no, I'm not going to contribute my technical knowledge. So he and General Groves and Conan Bryant went out to Los Alamos to talk to Oppenheimer. So they had a discussion out there. I don't know what the content was, but sometime the same day in the afternoon or the next day, Charlie was offered co-directorship of Los Alamos. Charlie had a lot of major commitments with Monsanto, and turned it down and said he couldn't do it. So they, Rose and Cohen Bryant got together and decided, well, we need someone to head up the program for the chemistry of plutonium. And that involved the University of California. At that time it was State College of Iowa State College rather, and the University of Chicago. And he was going to be the coordinator for both the chemistry and the metallurgy of plutonium, excuse me. So he accepted that assignment, and of course Monsanto agreed to it. Edgar Queenie blessed the situation, and so he got involved in that. So he was in constant contact with General Groves at the same time, because Groves kept his finger on everything. How he kept aware of what was going on and coordinating everything, I'd never know. But anyway, he did. Of course, next to him was Carol Hochwald, who was Monsanto signed the contract. He was the associate director of Nicholas Road, and he was also the associate director of the work for the Manhattan Project, which Monsanto had a contract for. Jim Lum on the right was a member of the research gang at Nicholas Road. I'm not sure what his exact title was, but he was very highly regarded by Charlie Thomas and Ted Hockwell. So anyway, so Charlie comes back in the spring of '43, and they start to work at Nicholas Road, and there's nothing else at this point in time. Mound's not there, Unit 3's not there, Unit 4's not there, and so they set aside one of the labs at Nicholas Road, and that way, of course, they had to get a guard on there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And of course, the lab is empty, there's nothing there. The chemistry and the metallurgy of polonium is essentially, the knowledge rather, is essentially zilch. And now they're going to try to develop an alpha emitter that's going to do something for the atomic program. I don't know how they maintain morale, but they did. So they started, well, they had to get together and decided that it was going to take about 9 to 10 chemists to meet the obligations of Monsanto with respect to the Manhattan Project. Little did they know that we probably in time would have something like 25 or 2,600 people here at Mound, but that was way beyond what they could imagine at that time. So Lum was part of the group. Nick Samaras was also part of that group, and they were the only ones at that time that were cleared. So Charlie assumed his other responsibilities at the same time, with Hockwald being, as it were, the number 2 man. And holy cow, I lost 15 minutes. But anyway, so they set up a lab, and Lum went out to the local universities and what have you to try to hire somebody. Now keep in mind there's a war going on, in case you don't remember. World War II is in full blow at that point in time. We're looking at 1943. And while I mentioned 1943, I want you to keep one thing in mind. The bomb at Hiroshima was 1946. You start out with Project 5, excuse me, thank you. It was August 6, 1940. Thank you, Don. There's a picture of Nicholas Road, but the Manhattan Project portion was only one laboratory. The equipment in the lab after maybe a week or 2 or 3 was, as they describe it in the literature, a bushel basket of laboratory glassware. And, well, there wasn't much that they could do. So they started research. Oh, the first non-Monsanto person that was hired was Joe Burbage. I don't know whether you all know Joe Burbage, but actually he was the lab director at Mound at one time after Dr. Herron. So after Lum and Thomas and Dr. Hockwell got together, they realized that the amount of work that was going to be needed could not be done at Central Research. They needed to find another place. That's what they found. The Board of Education, which we call Unit 3. There was obviously, you can't tell from the picture totally, Of course, you recognize that there's no windows or window frames or casements or anything. Most of the flooring had to be laid down new. Most of the plaster and the plaster walls had to be replastered. The electrical system was non-existent. The heating system was not in existence at all. And of course, back in '43, air conditioning was a strange word in a lot of cases. So they hired a contractor and began putting the building in shape to do some laboratory research work. Can we go back one more shot? No, sorry. That's how it's sat on Euclid and West First, which is on the west side of downtown Dayton off of First Street rather. And that was the building, that was the seminary, and the ground all around it is obviously has nothing but the trees, and it's just a big empty lot. Next slide. Okay, that was the main building, and the center portion. Thank you. That was the main building that you saw, and in time, in the upper right-hand corner, were warehouses. The warehouses were not what you think. They were really tropical huts, which were nothing more than a roof and aluminum sheet siding on 3 sides, and the front side was open to the elements. And of course, they had to build. They took that over in '43, I believe. But what you're looking at there is the buildings that were added, and that's the finished construction work at Unit 3 about the end of '45. That's how it looked after Monsanto got involved with it. Now the building to the right, you can barely make it out, is a Quonset hut, and that's where in time the triggers were manufactured for the program. We didn't have any other place to put it. We could have put it at Unit 4, but that was decided against because of the activity and this whole lot of other reasons that I'm not aware of. But they did put it there. In time, when we were cleaning up the place, we did take the Quonset hut down and we put it back up again down in the valley, just by the railroad tracks. Obviously, you recognize the guard shacks and all that, but that's how it looked when Monsanto moved down here, 49.
Moved down and around.
Yeah, I know, but I think we moved all of our operations in 49. That's what I remember. Yeah. Okay, so we moved everything from the bushel basket of laboratory glassware and a few other items. To Unit 3, we began hiring people. A couple of names come to mind. Larkin was it, and a few other people. Staniforth. And of course, I said Joe Burbage was already on the payroll when they came down here, but the number of bodies that we had was pretty small. It was something in the 20s or 30s. So they set up a R&D program on the first 2 floors of Unit 3. In case you're wondering, we went from Unit 1 to Unit 3, and yes, Monsanto management can count. There was a Unit 2, but it had nothing to do with the Manhattan Project. It was located off of 741 by the airport, whatever it's called today. And that was a separate contract that Monsanto had with the government for making jet assistant something or other to tack on airplanes so they could load them up with more bombs than the plane could normally carry, and they would get it off the ground, and they figured once they got off the ground it ought to stay in the air. Thank God it did. Okay, so in time they decided that they needed more room, one of which was Unit 3 was then going to be dedicated for the R&D work. They were going to make it larger. And Unit 4 would then become what they call, in broad terms, the production operation. So Charlie Thomas happened to be married to a very nice lady of the Talbot family. And the Talbot family had a playhouse, which we'll show you a picture of in a little bit. But just to show you how the Talbot family suffered, that was their home. There were 6 daughters and 2 sons, one of whom was Harold Talbot, who became Secretary of the Air Force, and I believe it was during Eisenhower's office. The other brother, whose name I don't know, managed the Talbot Realty Company, which occupied one entire floor of the Chrysler building, so they were not suffering. They did very well. Now, of course, the house, when we Monsanto, that is, I use the term broadly, took over Unit 4 in Oakwood. It was at the corner of Runnymede and Dixon, or in that neighborhood, as it were. The house was not there. The house had caught fire, and in early '44, the Talbot family had the house razed. You can't see it. Ah, there it is. Now, between the house and that's the playhouse. Now, in between that is a large parking lot, and that's where the employees used to park. So anyway, the playhouse is that roof you're looking at is a all glass roof. It's corrugated, and everything was there that's year. You got the next slide. Here you go. Oh, that's not what I was looking for, but that's all right. Those are.
Which one?
That's the entranceway to the playhouse. Now, that's one hell of a nice playhouse in my book. On the right there, you see arches. Those were lounges. So the Talbot family sat there and they could watch professional. Now, this is not just for them. They would bring in professional, world-class tennis players to play exhibits there, and they'd invite their friends. By the way, if you can't hear me because I wander from the microphone, raise your hand. I'll try to come back to where I'm supposed to be. Now, on the far wall, the lounge will show you in a minute, but on the far wall, there are doors to the right and left, which are a little hard. Can you catch them down with a little arrow? Down, there you go. Okay, you go down there, and there are stairways, you go downstairs to squash courts. When Monsanto took over the building, the thing that went down was squash courts with the microbalances, quartz fiber microbalances. And I can't tell you what it looked like because we were not welcome. If you didn't belong there, you didn't go. Classification, by the way, was pretty important. You've heard the expression, need to know. If you didn't need to know, they didn't tell you. And there was no use asking because they only got you in trouble. Now, the tennis court you're looking at was that area, that is, was used for many functions. The Talbot family was very generous with the use of the playhouse. Next slide, please. That's a public event, bridge tournament. Now the place for whatever charity that was for, or whatever group that was for, the Talbot family let any number of groups use the playhouse. And that's just an example of one of the things that they did. I'm sure there's others, but we don't have photographs. There really are very few photographs of Runnymede. Next slide, please. Okay, that's the layout of the building, and the total length was 176 feet, and the width was 78 feet. And that shows the tennis group in there. But off to the right was a stage, and Mrs. Talbot used to invite theatrical groups from New York to come in and perform, and then she'd invite her friends over for the evening. Behind that are locker rooms and showers and all that good stuff for the entertainers to take if and when they needed it. Now, the lounge is in the top part of the photograph there. Yeah, the one that Don had the arrow on. That's the one that you saw the picture of. That was the fancier one of the lounge areas from the standpoint of furnishing. There it is. Obviously, that was where they sat. After Monsanto took it over, those archways were all filled in and blocked out, walled in and all that. And that whole area of the four rooms or thereabouts became counting rooms. And access was, well, you can see off to the left, that's how you get out of there. Okay, next slide now. Okay, now, the Playhouse was not just a building. As its title down there, the main building, that's the one you saw, but there were other support buildings off to the right. The parking area at the top was, even above that, was where the house had been. And of course, we'd come into work and we park in, quote, obviously the parking area. And the guard shack was right there. So it was a complex. Off to the upper right-hand side, there's some small rooms, and they were what we call cold labs. The main portion of the building, I think that's room, is that room 1? Yeah. Okay. What happened is, Monsanto came in and then put up walls and a deck over the walls, the roof over the walls, because that was the only place that you could put mechanical equipment. The glass roof would not support any mechanical equipment for heating and ventilating and all that kind of stuff. So then the partitions, of course, for the various labs were built in, and we just filled, well, they just filled in the space, just pure and simple. Now at the bottom part of that main building, I didn't bring it up earlier, is a greenhouse, and below that, of course, is a, I call it cobblestone, only it wasn't completely cobblestone, but the reason the greenhouse was that big is Mrs. Talbot liked flowers, and she had a full-time gardener who raised flowers, and she had lots of flowers every day. So there's another story of that, which I'll get to in a little bit. Now you can see off to the lower right, that says Dixon Avenue, and it's Runnymede that goes kind of cattywampus up to the upper right. If you follow that down, that takes you to 5 Point in Oakwood. And when I first came to Monsanto, I had roomed at the Y because there was no place to rent. You couldn't rent any place. You couldn't buy a car because they wanted a small arm and a leg just to get on the list. Small arm and a leg in those days being $1,000 under the table. So I stayed at the Y and used to catch it. I was lucky, as were a lot of other people. We caught the bus in front of the Y, got off at 5 Point, and walked up the hill, and the reverse of that was easy in the evenings. And one other thing, which had nothing to do with anything mechanical, but one thing I noticed when I showed up the first day, which was in May of '46, was the fact that almost everybody was about my age. Not today. I was only 27 in those days. But you have to keep in mind, whether it was here or Unit 3, the average age, rather, most everybody, all the employees except for maybe Dr. Herring, who was not old and gray-haired at that time, it was only uncrowded. Most everybody was under 30. And if you moved it up to 35, that was practically everybody in those days. So there was a hell of a lot of skill by a lot of young people, who, by the way, were dedicated as all can be. Okay, next slide now. Okay, now, so we set up process equipment and all that, but early on, all the work that was done was accomplished in standard laboratory fume hoods. Obviously, it's just an open face with a nice big strong blaster area going through, and the work was done, as it were, almost in the open. So they had to work out a system to contain all the activity. That's the second glove box line that was built. Another engineer and I were the guys that did that. In those days, even though we had a union, we helped the craftsmen. I mean, we did everything. And they were nice guys, and we were nice guys, and they get along real well. Now, no, the plywood that you see up there is just plain raw plywood. There's a mashing line on the other side behind it with a corridor, which was considered high risk. And so we did get the picture taken, and the gentleman that's in there was an ex-Navy guy, very nice gentleman, Herb Anson. Little side story about him. He came in one day and told our boss he had to go home because his wife was in tears. His wife was a teacher. She came home from her teaching job, And the lady, this is down in Waynesville, I believe, the lady that watched the kids said, the FBI was around asking about your husband, and if he's in trouble, I'm not going to sit for you anymore, and out the door she went. Now you know why. Now you know why. Now you know why we did it. So obviously, our boy named Dr. Burbage, Joe Burbage at that time. I'm not sure how many people called Joe Dr. Burbage, but anyway, it was fairly common that everybody called him Joe. But anyway, so Herb went home, and by the next day they found somebody. But now, if you look at the round sections in the face of the hood, you see something hanging down there, and those were the gauntlets. They were made out of vinyl sheet, and they were seam welded over Unit 3. They were made in our laundry by the seamstresses, and the gloves at the end were standard. They were heavy-duty rubber gloves, and what the attaching device were embroidery boots, small ones, to the large embroidery boots, of course, attached to the face of the glove boxes, and those are also embroidery boots, rather, excuse me. So, no, as I said earlier, we did not operate anything in the box that had not been coated with fire retardant paint, at least a couple coats, the finish coat and all that. So that was still under, as it were, under construction. I'm surprised that we even found that photograph, because at the time we weren't allowed to take pictures. But I've hung on to that one. Next one. Okay, now this is the backside of the Playhouse. Dixon Avenue is running along at the bottom of the screen, kind of almost horizontal, but not quite. And but by the time we got in there to really clean it up even a little better, the guard shack there was gone, and to the left of that guard shack was a mulberry tree. And so one day when we're cleaning it up, Joe Burbage calls me up. Oh, by the way, I had a crew of 27 people to do all this work. And they were a bunch of nice guys. They worked real hard. We didn't have any procedures to follow, so another young health physics guy and I dreamed up a routine as to how we were going to decontaminate it, because the rooms were really contaminated. If you walked in there, the dust would stir around, and if you take an air sample of that, you'd find out that we had something like 100,000 counts for whatever it was. Warren, what the hell are you? What would that be for? Cubic meter or something like that?
CC, I don't know.
So obviously we had to develop some new procedures. But moving backwards to the yard where I told you about the mulberry tree, one afternoon Joe Burbage calls me up and he says, there's a lady from Oakwood that lives across the street called up, and she's upset. She's both upset and angry and worried. Okay, so what's the problem? He said, well, there's radioactivity all over the cobblestones on the lower lot. And I said, I don't understand. What do you mean? How did she know? I said, well, let me go and see what she's talking about. So I'll call you right back. So I go down there, and there's mulberries all over the ground. That's the radioactivity fault. I haven't figured it out yet. So I go back up and tell him. He says, well, what are you going to do about it? I almost said, well, what the hell do you want me to do about it? But he didn't tell that to the plant manager, obviously. So I said, okay, we'll take care of it. So now he said, do something that will impress the lady that we're trying to respond to her concerns. So not having a whole lot of whatever to do with, I got to thinking, so I dressed three of the workers up like that. Those aren't the people, by the way. That's something else. The health physics people that are here at Mound. That's the Mound in the background, by the way. And I'm not sure, but I think that's an alpha meter in the hand of one of those guys. But two of the guys had big shovels about that wide, and one of them had a big, heavy broom that was about that wide with bristles about that deep, and they began sweeping up all the mulberries. And the other one guy with a shovel would scoop up the mulberries, and he'd throw them in a 55-gallon drum. And of course, they were dressed like that, so if that didn't impress anybody, I was out of ideas at that point in time. So that took about maybe 45 minutes or so. We cleaned it all up, and I didn't think to call Joe back to tell him anything. I just figured he said to do it, and so we did it. Well, about 15 minutes later, after we finished, which took us about maybe, I said yes, I didn't do it, they did. It was about a half an hour, I guess, maybe, and he called up and he says, "What'd you do? This lady is delirious. She's so happy for whatever you did." so I told him, and he got quite a chuckle out of that. Now, the next day there were mulberries on the ground again, of course not the same amount, but she never called up again. So I have no idea what was going on. Okay, so next slide. Nope, we got to go back to the well, that's not what I have. The greenhouses, you can see the truck there, and the greenhouse is running horizontally pretty much. So one day, this is warm weather, obviously, almost. But at the end of the summer, I'll take that back. Now that I see the trees, there's no leaves on it, so it sure as hell can't be August. So anyway, truck there was probably hauling some hot stuff, but anyway, we had all the glass at the time was in place. You can see some of the spots that were missing. Well, at that time, my boss, who was a gentleman by the name of Wallbank, who was in charge of the design engineering group, called up and he said, the plant manager and the area manager and a couple of us are going to come down to see what kind of progress you're making. Come on down. I mean, the place looked like a wreck, because it was a wreck. We were wrecking it. That's why it looked like a wreck. So anyway, so I got to thinking, boy, these guys are coming down and we're going to show them, you know, a place it's a wreck. We're cleaning it up. We're tearing it apart, getting rid of all the hot stuff, contaminated materials. And so somehow or other, I always told my grandchildren, if you think hard enough, the good Lord will provide. So I go down to the lower area, which is to the left and on down. There were 14 acres down there, which some of the employees of the Talbot family, one primarily, had a garden because that had been part of their estate, the 14 acres. And there were fruit trees down there, and that's where they gardened and all that good stuff. And I dug around there, and I brought in about that many rocks. I took a bag with me. The stone's about so big, about an inch in diameter, if you can't see what I'm doing here. And about 20 feet in front of where about that truck is, I lined up 4 piles of rocks right on the ground, about 4 feet apart. So they came in, and I took them on a small tour and showed them what we were doing and why we were doing it, and how we were doing it. And then I took them out to the back. And I said, "Gentlemen, I'd like to have each one of you stand by a pile of rocks." And they're looking at me like I'd lost my marbles completely. And I said, "Now, I know that you've been brought up not to break windows. You just can't do it. But now here's your opportunity. I'm going to give you a chance to vent your spleen for what you've always wanted to do, and you've been inhibited and you can't do it. Now there's a pile of rocks for each one of you guys. We're going to break the glass out anyway and run it up and ship it to Oak Ridge. Break them out." Would you believe nobody moved? They looked at each other and they kind of had a sick-looking smile looking at each other. They just couldn't move. So I thought, well, I better tell them again. So I told them the second time, nobody still moved. And so I finally bent down and picked up a couple of rocks, threw it with the glass, broke a bunch of panes out there, and then all of a sudden they got the message. And they all bent out, and man, they gave it hell like you can't believe. So that was my contribution to making their day. Next slide now. After we cleaned up, or got rid of all the contamination, of course, the going with them was, we were able to let out a contract to tear the building down because it was going to cost the arm and the leg to get it back in the condition that they had like when you saw it to begin with. And that's a private contractor. The guy's name was Minigan, and he had a crew in there, but you'll see from the workers, even though the place was clean, the health village people still wanted, just in case, wanted them to wear whites, and of course they had to give urine samples every week or so. Now the workers, by the way, we had, as I told you, I had 27 employees, and everybody had a urine check every week. I don't know how it happened, but nobody ever was pulled off the job, because at that point in time, I think the standard was 15 disintegrations per minute per milliliter, was it? Somewhere in that neighborhood.
Much higher.
What?
I said much higher than it got to be later. I know that.
Well, we never had to pull anybody off the job, because somehow we got lucky. But everybody followed all the procedures. I mean, the workers, I have to give them credit, did follow the procedures. No one ever smoked or ate or whatever in the area. So, by the way, when we finished, before we turned it over to the contractor, we had excavated about 18 inches of topsoil all around the building, until the health physics people were satisfied. But we started from when there was 0 counts at the surface of the soil. We went down 18 inches beyond that. That was all drummed and hauled over the bridge, and it was assumed that it was going to be hot, even though it wasn't. That was an assumption. And then, oh yeah, I'll get there in a minute. I got 20 minutes here. Well, I might as well tell you, after the contractor finished, off to the right, the ground was all leveled and cleared, and everything was fixed up nice, like it was supposed to be. But some areas around there, for whatever reason, I have no idea, the contractor was told to excavate another 3 feet, even though there was nothing, but they wanted to make sure everybody was happy. So they did that. Well, you can see that there's a sign that says Runnymede, thanks to Dr. Solinger. And we restored everything like it was supposed to be restored, with the exception, of course, the buildings. And today it's some very beautiful homes around the parking lot, the circle, as it were. And everybody's happy, except well, 5 years or so after that, I was at Dorothy Lane Market picking up something. In case you don't know it, the Dorothy Lane Market is the center of the social world of the universe. And a friend of my wife's came up and said, "Didn't you work at Runnymede?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Do you know that the incidence of breast cancer among women is higher for the immediate residents than it is for anywhere else?" I said, "No, I did not know that, but personally I don't really believe it." So she says, "Oh yeah." And I said, "Well, how do you know that?" She says, "Well, that's what I found out either in a book club or..." I said, "Well, I'll tell you what, the city of Dayton has a medical director. Why don't you call him up and ask him what the incidence of breast cancer among women immediately around where Runnymede was and the rest of the city, and then come back and call me and I'll see what I can do for you." I wasn't going to do anything, to be honest with you, except tell her to go see Dr. Regan. But hey, that was his job. So I never heard it. Well, about 2 weeks later, I run into another lady friend of my wife's, and I get the same story. Well, this time she mentions the word plutonium. One minute it's polonium, and the next minute it's plutonium, and that's when you're, uh-oh, that's the problem right there. So I told her, no, we never had plutonium there as far as I know. And I was there from the real early days, and I helped clean it up, and no, we did not have plutonium. So eventually that rumor died. Anyway, so when we turned it back over to the Talbot family, it was nice and green and lush. Everything was good and nice. Now, of course, when the government signed the contract for the Talbot family, or the Talbot Realty Company, they were going to restore everything and give it back to the government. Well, obviously we couldn't do that. It was just going to cost too much, period. And so the government negotiated and they settled. No, I'm not going to ask you to guess how much they got for it, because you're not going to believe it, but the government paid the Talbot family, excuse me, $138,000.
Oh, God.
Now you got to keep in mind that was about 1950. Okay. Now, oh yeah, one of the instructions that I had when we took over Runnymede to clean it up was that we couldn't save anything. Everything had to be buried or brought over here to the mound. Incidentally, all the concrete and block work and all that stuff was nice and clean, so it was dumped up on the far side of the hill, just a little north of the plutonium area, way back when. I don't know if it's still there or not. I have no idea. But anyway, well, we did manage to, I managed to steal 2 doorknobs off the front doors that went into Unit 4. That's one of them, and then the other one I gave to the Historical Society of Oakwood. And that's all I kept. Now that chunk of whatever you see in the upper left-hand side there is part of the roof. I don't know who saved it, but somebody did. We got it here at the museum, and we still have it.
It was dug up here at Mound.
What?
It was dug up here at Mound to clean the
Oh.
floor
Right
that
on.
we gave it to.
Okay. So that's the extent of the artifacts that we got from the building itself. Now there are some others that you'll see around here. That's about the end of that one. It's nice. Okay. So somewhere around, I believe it was in '46, a decision was made by the government that Runnymede was not going to be able to continue doing what they were doing, making, purifying polonium from business slugs. They were going to have to, let me back up on that. I just mentioned the word business slugs. That triggered another one of my stories. I've been on the job all of 1 week, and no, I'm not in the area where they're processing business slugs. And someone comes and says, they want you down by the Marlite room. I said, what's the Marlite room? Well, there's a room down on the ground floor of the playhouse. It's all walled in, and that's where they're processing the business slugs. And of course, the walls, the partitioning is made of Marlite board. Marlite is masonite, which is a hard enamel finish on it. Now, the term Marlite stayed with that operation until we finally abandoned Mound, and the area where they used to process the business slugs, even down in the team building, was still called the Marlite area, so the name stuck with it. But anyway, they said, they want you down there, so I got down there, and there's, about 8 or 9 or 10 guys all lined up. Well, I knew they didn't belong in the Marlite area, because when they had taken me on a tour of the building the first day I reported for work, they told me this is where they dissolve the slug. There's a couple of glass-lined kettles, reactors in the room. And so they said, put on these gloves, so I put on some cotton liners, surgical gloves, and I got in line, and then I found out when I got into the room, there was looked like an egg crate made out of steel. It was about this wide, about 4 feet long, maybe a little bit longer. And then there, looking like an egg crate, were all these business slugs, about 4 inches long and a little over 1 inch in diameter. At the top of the reactor, I didn't spend any time, as I said earlier, you didn't go into an area where you weren't welcome. But anyway, so the top of the reactor, or partial of the top, an opening about yay big. There's a flange off of that. And here was a glass-lined reactor called a floodwood kettle in our case. And they said, what are we supposed to do? And they said, well, they'll tell you. So I noticed that the guy in the front of the line held for this guy, had a pair of tongs, and picked up a business slug. He handed the guy, and the guy, one of the chemists or whomsoever, would pick up the business with his hand, get up on the platform, and he'd lower it into the kettle in this reactor. Like that. What's going on? And they said, well, you have to do that by hand because there's no way to drop those in the kettle without breaking the glass. Well, when it was my turn, I got up and I looked in there, and there was a about big around, well, about 8, 9, 10 inches of the bottom of the hill was filled with dry ice. What they did is they just laid the slugs on top of the dry ice to try to arrange it. Then of course, as it evaporated later on, after they put the flange back on and put the heat back on the reactor, the dry ice would evaporate and the slugs would be lowered very gradually. You wouldn't break the glass lining on there, which was very thin. Incidentally, every time they finished with a reaction in the reactor, which might have taken at least a week, they checked the lining with an electrostatic unit, Tesla coil, I believe it was at that time. So that maintained the integrity of the reactor. Now that's talking about, for those of you who drove up the hill for many times, before the hill was there, and before the farm, before Mound was there, that's what it looked like. That's at the bottom of the hill, just before, well, with a big sign that says Mound Development.
Advanced technology.
Yeah, thank you. Thinking about now I've learned that. I mean, hell, it's only 4 words. So that was it. The area at the time was a little under 200 acres. And when I retired in '86, we had well over 200 acres because there was another purchase later on made of additional real estate for the lab. And that's a picture when it was completed. And well, actually, when it was completed, we moved in January, but that picture was taken in '48. And of course, today it doesn't look anything like that. It's enough to give me heartburn, like I can't believe, but that's the way it is. Now, the foreground of the picture that you're looking at, to the right, are they're either 2-story or 3-story, I call them wooden shacks. Those were the offices for both the contractor, both the Maxim Construction, who had the contract, the government, I think it was still the AEC in those days, and Monsanto. That's where the cafeteria was. Well, that's where everybody was housed. To the left there at the bottom, those were the warehouses for material. And now can you catch the HH building down there now? Yeah, okay. Now, I mentioned the Marlite room, and we had to process the slugs, which were aluminum jacketed business slugs, which had been irradiated out of Hanford. The first batch we ever received from irradiation were irradiated at Oak Ridge. And mentioning Oak Ridge, classification was a big thing, security was a big thing, and you won't believe this, I guess you will, but the code word for Oak Ridge when I first came here was dog patch. So I thought it was appropriate personally. Well, from the T building Marlite cells down to that HH building, which stood for hydrolysis house, there were 4 2-inch glass lines in parallel, and when they removed the aluminum jackets, I wish I had to begin with. I could have playing with this everyone. There was a tunnel from the Marlite cells, which were, let's see, about underneath here, about that spot. It went down underground through a 6-foot diameter concrete pipe to the hydrolysis house. And yeah, the wall between the outer perimeter walls, by the way, for the T building, which you can't see, but there's the entrance. No, yeah, that's the entrance. And then the exit, of course, is way over on the other side. It's one-way traffic. Then, of course, after the business slugs are dissolved, and we've extracted the polonium out of it, that, I call it waste, but it really wasn't waste. It was recycled at the time, but not here. I assume it was done at Oak Ridge. would be sent down a hydrolysis house, precipitated out, drummed, and then they after, I think they were shipped to Oak OH, I believe, as I remember. Now the T building is right on to here, and in time we put another building on there called the DS building, which was for explosives work that we had here. Detonator work we had here at Mound, also that DS building, incidentally, held a standards lab, which was secondary to the Bureau standards in Washington. That's the quality of the stuff that we did here at Mound. Now the T building itself was unique in a number of ways. It had to be bomb-proof to a 2,000-pound penetrating bomb. The roof deck was 15 feet thick and with a hell of a lot of it reinforcing. A great deal of that reinforcing, by the way, is larger than the rib diameter of my wrist. We had a piece of it here, but somebody decided they wanted it work. What you do with a big hunk of steel like that, I have no idea, but somebody did. So the sidewalls, we say are 17 foot, but that's a nominal dimension. They're actually 16 feet 9 inches. Those are sidewalls. And then down through the middle, that's 3 foot wide, also reinforced. Now the T building proper has only really 2 operating areas. The area you're looking at there is the operations floor, and that's where all the labs are. This side over here is the cold side, and all the hot sides over here, which is where the processing went on. As I mentioned, that wall is 3 foot. Each side had its own change rooms. Ladies obviously had theirs as well as the men. And I think, I'm not sure, I'm trying to find it, but I think those were the Marlite cells.
Yeah, they were downstairs.
Yeah, they were downstairs off the ground floor.
There we go.
There it is. Okay, now the downstairs had all the heating and ventilating equipment. Keep in mind now we had a clean area, we had a low risk area, and we had a high risk area. And of course filter banks were needed. A couple of unique features in addition to what I've already told you. There was also biological proof. There were biological filters. They were concerned about that. Had there been any type of special gaseous attack, there was a filtration and a purification system to remove whatever the agent was that would damage the health and or whatever. Because the building was supposed to be operable for 30 days without anybody going in or out. I don't remember where the water tanks were, but we had water tanks inside. We had a power generator, which was, I forget how many kilowatts that they generated. But even long after the building was finished and all that, about once a month, those of you can remember Al Unser was the engineer that would go down there and run the generators to make sure that when they pushed the button, it would start. One time we did have an exercise. How I got to be lucky enough to be chosen as one of them, but we had to stay in the building overnight, couldn't leave, all that good stuff. We got the K rations and sleep on the cot. Thank God it was only for one night. It wasn't all that bad. But anyway, the building was unique in itself. Well, of course, in time, we did put another building on top of the T building, named, as I mentioned earlier, the DS building. Now, people talk about the T building being a 5-level building. That's not quite accurate. What you have is the first up to the 5th level. The 5th level is the ground level. So when you went in the building, you were coming in off the main walk, you were the same level. There are some storage areas, I believe, on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, but I'm not sure. At least one of them I know. One, you know?
3rd and 4th.
3rd and 4th, okay. What they stored in there, I have no idea, but it was always classified and it was none of your business. By the way, talking about that, none of your business, there was a period, again, due to security reasons, we had guards at a number of different buildings. The R building, for example, had one, the T building had one, I think the B and the I building had them. And if you didn't have the right color tape on your badge, you couldn't get in there. Classification was important. The DS building went right on top of that. Those are cross sections of the east tower. The east tower was when you went down to the cold side, the west tower you went down to the hot side. And periodically, I don't know what that was, we'd have the entire lab would have an exercise and everybody would go down the T building because there was going to be a big bomb attack by the Russians. It wasn't bad getting down into it, because going downhill for 5 stories wasn't bad. The problem was the elevators wouldn't run. They came out. So you had to walk. But anyway, so much for that. It was a great, the building is still here. As you probably, for those of you that have been up here before, especially in the summertime, you can see most of the buildings are gone, as are the stacks. The stacks, by the way, were 200 feet high, one of which was 6 foot diameter opening at the top, the other was 8 foot, and it exhausted nothing but air after the filtration of the air that we had. There's you saw the wooden elephant that we had earlier. That's a shot of manipulators being used because the product that we're using, again, this is a situation where we want to protect the worker. Those are manipulators that transfer every little movement of every finger that you have. I showed you the one wooden glove box. That's a little bit. That's a little bit. They're stainless steel. They were helium tight, a whole lot of other stuff. And you can see that everybody has a respirator. Well, you can't see that many bodies, but you always had to wear a respirator around your neck in case the alarm went off, which meant that there was a leak from the glove box back onto the room. There wasn't negative pressure rather. So in case there was any leakage in the glove box, the air from out the room would leak out the glove box and not get out the door. That was a pretty tight thing. And that's the way the air flowed. That's another one. It's pretty sophisticated. We can't show you what's in the inside because I have no idea what's inside. But we get tanks of what have you. And there's a real neat shot of what's almost left of Mound. For those of you who have been up here on the hill before, that's about it. Now, we set off a bomb. That's Hiroshima in '45 on August 6th. That's what it looked like. That's what it looks like there. Now, everybody worries and wonder how could we have been so cruel to kill 70,000 people in one fell swoop. But prior to that, we had bombed with fire bombs only Tokyo, and we killed 100,000 people. And I don't get excited about that. I don't understand that. Now, the one thing the public in general does not know to this day, even though there's been at least one TV program about it. We've shown one CD or one evening of what happened by way of the Japanese development of their atomic weapon. For your benefit, they were within 6 to 12 months of detonating an Alamogordo type situation. And they were going to then build probably had enough radioactivity or getting pretty close to build an atomic weapon. And the target, primary target, #1 target at that time, was going to be San Francisco. And let's go back. Had they been successful, folks, that would have been San Francisco. Now, how are they going to get the bomb there? They built a submarine. They could handle an airplane on the inside, dismantled. The long surface of the front of it is going to be a runway. They'd already built this, by the way. They'd already built an airplane, designed an airplane to carry a bomb. The submarine was going to have the airplane and a bomb and a pilot and all the other stuff that goes along with it.
They showed that on the news the night before last.
Oh, they did?
On the news, they showed the submarine that they found it.
No, I don't watch the news. I don't want to get depressed. No, I didn't know that. But So, yes, I feel bad. In fact, I feel bad about war, period. But I cannot fault President Truman for making the decision, because if they'd have gotten there ahead of us, that would have been San Francisco. Number 2 target, by the way, was going to be in Los Angeles. Other than that, folks, I enjoy your attention. I appreciate it. Even your laughing at my corny jokes, I appreciate that too. Thank you.